former Deputy Brendan Howlin. Ask the Minister to move amendment number 2 in his name.
Firstly, can I seek permission of the House to share my time with Deputies Buttermore, Lyons, Coffey and Keaveney?
Great.
I move the government amendment in my name. I must say at the beginning, if we could tap hyperbole, we'd be able to power the entire nation of Ireland. We wouldn't need board gas Éireann from the words coming from Deputy Ellis and his cohorts. I love the idea, though, that you never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So we're selling our youth. People are dying and freezing in their homes. We're creating no jobs. The fact that we announced in the last week alone 1,500 jobs. 1,500 jobs. And I know Lascan it's very difficult, but you see, in a national crisis, there is an obligation, even on Sinn Féin, to work towards the recovery of this country, as this government is. And you see, despite your best efforts, we're going to succeed. I want to welcome the opportunity to explain the rationale of the government's decision announced last week to proceed with the programme of state asset disposals involving board gas Éireann Energy, some of the ESB's non-strategic power generation capacity, some aspects of Cuilta and the state's remaining shareholding in Aer Lingus. Last week's announcement was the culmination of a long process which began before the current government took office and must be seen against the background and considered in that context. In the comments following last week's announcements, and again, Lascian Corla, we heard the same trite comments tonight, Sinn Féin members adhere to the flat earth policy in respect of state assets. There is to be no change. That seems to be the mantra. I'd suggest you look around you. All has changed utterly. The Labour Party remains committed to significant state involvement in a modern, dynamic economy. The state can play a direct role in fostering economic growth or help provide the skills and supports that foster private sector growth. Both are worthy of support. An asset is not strategic simply because it's owned by the state. That's something worthy of Joe Higgins. The world has moved on since then, lads. That's a plain fact. And I must say I welcome Deputy O'Quailon's interest in my party's history tonight. I can say this, we will be writing a history of the Labour Party to commemorate our centenary, and it will be a lot more wholesome and a lot more civilised reading than the history of his own party. This government has adopted a dynamic attitude to the state sector. New era has been established to ensure that the state and the taxpayer derived best value from their investment in state companies. Let's remember that these companies exist to serve the taxpayer, not the other way around. And that includes releasing capital back into a capital-starved economy, if that is in the people's interests. We've been at pains to point out what the public interest is and to protect it. Unlike Fianna Fáil's privatisation of Eircom, properly criticised by the deputies opposite, there is no sale proposed of the strategic networks or assets in this proposal. ESB remains a vertically integrated utility free to compete in the soon-to-arrive European marketplace. The gas network will remain entirely in public ownership. So too will Dublin Port. We will not sell the Cuilta land. Selling the crops, lads, is not a catastrophe. Selling the crops is what we grow the trees for. What do you want to do? Throw sugar at them? It's far from being hostile to state enterprise.
Order, please.
I didn't interrupt anybody over there, but you can't listen to the truth.
Minister, please.
Far from being hostile to state enterprises, this is a government that is setting up a state enterprise to run Irish Water, unlike the jurisdiction opposite. We continue to believe the state has an active role to play in the marketplace. But we recognise too that the strategic interest of the state does not remain static or fixed over time. What was strategic when electricity was being installed and run up and down the country in the 1930s is not necessarily strategic now in a competitive all-island marketplace. When the current government took office almost a year ago, we inherited a situation whereby the state was unable to fund itself, but instead was dependent on funding, as everybody knows, from the EU IMF under a programme instituted by the previous government. The work of the review group on state assets and liabilities under the chairmanship of Colin McCarthy, which had been commissioned by the previous government, was still in train and was approaching finalisation. That group reported in April of 2011 and concluded that the realisation of the proceeds from the sale of state assets offered the potential to assist in tackling the fiscal crisis, both by reducing the debt burden on the state and also by supporting economic recovery through enhancing productive efficiency and competitiveness. It recommended that a planned programme of non-strategic asset sales be undertaken. The original MOU with the EU, ECB, IMF partners also addressed the issue of asset disposal. It required the Irish authorities to undertake an independent assessment of the electricity and gas sectors, building on the work of the review group, and then to consult with the European Commission services with a view to setting appropriate targets for the privatisation of state-owned assets. In negotiating the programme for government, the two government parties accepted that a new approach to the management and use of the state assets in the interests of this economy and the people and of job creation was required as part of the mechanism to address the fiscal crisis. As members of the House will be aware, the programme for government included a commitment to release the value from the state's portfolio of assets with the intention of using the proceeds to fund investment in the productive capacity of the economy in the context of the new era entity which we propose to establish. A target of up to €2 billion from the sale of non-strategic assets was agreed, drawing from the recommendations of the review group, but with the assets only to be sold when market conditions were right and when adequate regulatory structures had been put in place to protect consumers. In the years since the government took office, we have made significant progress in advancing the government's plans with regard to the use of state assets. Last year, the government established the New Era entity to reform the manner in which the state's shareholding in semi-state companies is managed for the good of every citizen in the land. New Era is now proactively overseeing corporate governments from a shareholder's perspective of the commercial semi-states in the energy sector, ESB, Airgrid, Bordgas, Bord na Móna and Cuillte, where it is advising relevant ministers in relation to matters such as dividend policy, capital investment plans, approval of borrowings and so on. The government also set up the Strategic Investment Fund last year within the NTMA as a forerunner to the establishment of the Strategic Investment Bank, which we have committed to do. Drawing the resources from the National Pension Reserve Fund in combination with matching commercial investment from the private sector, the Strategic Investment Fund will channel resources towards the productive sector of the economy. So the sale of state assets, the up to $1 billion we can get from that, will be one element of getting absolutely needed capital. We will use the National Pension Reserve Fund. We will use other funds such as the European Investment Bank and the Bank of the Council of Europe as well, and any other private sector funding we can leverage up to drive an agenda of growth and recovery. New Era is working closely with the Strategic Investment Fund and the National Pension Reserve Fund to ensure that commercial investment opportunities are developed. Considerable progress has been made over the past year in assessing the suitability of a range of state assets. Two working groups were established last year, one to consider the best approach in progressing the proposed part sale of the ESB, including energy policy, regulatory, legal, financial, economic considerations, and the other to undertake a similar analysis of a number of other semi-state assets. Both of these groups completed their work and reported to ministers in December of last year. New Era was also centrally involved in this whole process, together with my department, the Department of Communications, Energy and Natural Resources, the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, the Department of Transport, Tourism and Sport, and the Department of Finance. It was on the basis of the analysis undertaken by these two working groups that the government last week agreed to the list of asset disposals announced on the 22nd of February, and also agreed not to proceed with the minority stake in the vertically integrated ESB as we had previously decided, because that wasn't the best way to advance. The analysis undertaken in relation to the original ESB transaction identified a range of complex regulatory, legislative and policy issues which would have to be addressed before a part sale of that company as an integrated utility could proceed. Accordingly, it was not practical to continue with that proposal. And of course, the government also achieved a significant breakthrough in terms of our negotiations with the Troika on the use of state assets. And I want to thank the engagement we've had, protracted engagement with our partners on that basis. Instead of a programme of state assets of $5 billion, which they originally posited with us, to be used exclusively to retire debt, which was the original plan, we've now agreed that in return for a commitment to a target of €3 billion, of up to €3 billion, the government will be permitted to retain 1/3 of the proceeds to invest in job-creating initiatives to stimulate the economy, which is so desperately needed. And that's one thing which the deputies opposite are absolutely right about. Jobs is the focus, first and last, of this government. That is, there will be no fire sales. Let me be clear about that. There will be no fire sales. If we don't get a proper price, we will sell nothing. Is that clear? Am I clear enough? That assets will be sold. Assets will be sold on acceptable terms at a price that achieves fair value for the taxpayer. The key strategic assets, such as our electricity and gas transmission and distribution systems, will not be included in any disposal, but will be retained in state ownership. I believe the agreement reached with the Troika represents very real and significant progress.
3 minutes remaining, Minister.
Turning now to the specific assets that are to be sold, in deciding on the programme that I announced last week, the government has been careful to safeguard the position of strategic infrastructure, such as I've said repeatedly, as the gas and electricity networks, which were considered to be vital to the functioning of our economy. The House will have noted that these assets are not part of the disposal programme. What will be sold is the energy business of Bord Gas Éireann, not including BGE's gas transmission or distribution systems or the 2 gas interconnectors, which will remain in state ownership. So it's by and large, the wind energy and other soft energy options that BGE has built up over time. And nobody can argue to me that they have to be held in state ownership from a strategic basis. The Minister for Communications, Energy and Natural Resources will consult with the Commission for Energy Regulation and the ESB and advise Government in relation to the specific ESB assets to be sold, with the objective of materially improving the competitive dynamics of the single electricity market to the benefit of consumers, as well as realising the assets for the productive purposes I've outlined. I also indicated that consideration, and it's a different decision. I asked the House to pay attention to this. We've said on the first level of issues, we're going to sell them when the market conditions and regulatory issues are right. But in relation to Cuilta, consideration will be given to the sale of some of their assets. This will focus primarily on the harvesting rights of the Cuilta forests, but I already made it clear that Cuilta's land holding is not for sale. Finally, in relation to Aer Lingus, the Government accepts that the State's remaining 25% shareholding in the company is not a strategic asset. It does not enable the Government to determine Aer Lingus' policy on issues such as the use of the landing slots at Heathrow Airport. Unfortunately, the previous administration, in selling off 75% of the company, already moved that out of state hands. Accordingly, the Government has decided that that shareholding in Aer Lingus will be sold at the appropriate time when market conditions are favourable and an acceptable price is agreed. In conclusion, I believe that the policy that has been pursued by the Government, that we've set out, that we've carefully tacked over the last year, in terms of reforming the manner in which our state assets are managed for the benefit of the taxpayer, for the benefit of job creation, to get best value for the shareholders in this, which is the people of Ireland, is the right thing to do. We've identified the optimum means of releasing value from some of the non-strategic state assets in an appropriate way. Given the fiscal and economic challenges facing this economy, that's the right thing to do. I'm confident that the asset disposal programme which I announced last week, which, for the information of deputies opposite, was endorsed obviously unanimously by Government, will have a significant positive outcome by driving competition and driving down prices in the energy sector, as well as generating desperately needed resources for investment in jobs and in the recovery of our economy. On that basis, I commend the Government's amendment to the House.
Thank you, Minister.